the National Defense College student body of class 2004, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, may I introduce to you the ambassador to East Timor. ขออนุญาตแนะนำท่านเอกอัครทูตไทยประจำติมอร์ตะวันออกครับผมคุณกุมุตสิงหรานายุทธยาครับ Today is a very special day for all of us at the National Defense College of Thailand. We are very much honored by being a part of the event series called Bridges, Dialogues Toward a Culture of Peace, hosted through the International Peace Foundation. As we are all very well aware that Thailand has been the focal attention and being promoted to become a center of peace, diplomacy, and international understanding. Before going into further details, may I first present to you the chairman of the board of directors of the International Peace Foundation, who would kindly give us an overview of the organization, its program being conducted since November of last year up until April of this year. And that's going to be conducted not only in Bangkok, but also throughout the various provinces and regions of Thailand. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chairman himself, Mr. Uwe Morawetz, please. Up here, please.
As a contribution to the decade for a culture of peace and nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly in the year 2000, Thailand has now been chosen as the host country for the event series Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, initiated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political independent foundation under the common patronage of the 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. Thailand has been chosen for the following reasons. The Thai nation and its people, with their self-confidence, open-mindedness and tolerance, provide a creative pathway towards peace which could serve as an inspiring role model for the prevention, mediation and solution of conflicts. Under the wisdom and spiritual leadership of His Majesty the King, as the shining example for inner and outer peace, a democratic Thailand has the ability to promote peace and the potential to stabilize the region. It has a rich, diversified network of national and international organizations, including business, diplomats, media and NGOs, which provide the ground for an enhanced intercultural dialogue. Dialogue, a culture of peace and nonviolence are deeply rooted in Thai society, not only as concepts, but as a common practice in the form of and the process towards the middle way. Based on this knowledge and wisdom, Thailand could become an international platform from which the spiral of violence and racism which dominates the world of today could turn into a deeper understanding towards aspects of peace and pluralism which have been neglected far too long. To promote the kingdom as a center for dialogue and international understanding, the International Peace Foundation has invited 24 Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, literature and economics to join hands with Thai leaders in all parts of society in a series of more than 200 lectures and dialogues, seminars, workshops and conferences to be held in Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Khon Kaen, Songkhla until April 2005. I am grateful for the wide support the people of Thailand have provided for the preparations of Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, which draws its inspiration from the tireless efforts of His Majesty the King for peace and prosperity of all peoples, cultures and religions. I thank His Excellency Professor Jose Ramos-Horta and all keynote speakers who waived their honorarium for the benefit of the events, General Bonsrang and General Tanongsak, and the National Defense College, and all sponsors and partners for the important cooperation, and I welcome all participants joining us in the upcoming events to step towards a culture of peace through dialogue, understanding, and mutual respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uwe. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned earlier, that the National Defense College of Thailand is very honored upon visits of many distinguished guest speakers. And today, I'm very delighted to present to you another one of the most world-renowned lecturers of all time. I'm certain that Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta is well known to all of us here. His topic today is very interesting, up to date, and very much in line with the current world situation. That is, the unipolar world. Can the U.S. lead? Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta is presently the Senior Minister and Minister of the Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of East Timor. He was born on the 26th of December, 1949, in Dili, the capital city of East Timor. His mother is Timorese, and his father is Portuguese. He is one of 11 children of the family. His primary education is in East Timor, and he is a Catholic. Later, he was educated and trained in several institutes and universities, both in Europe and United States, mainly concerning the international law, the human rights law, the foreign policy, and peace study. He holds more than 10 honorary doctorate degrees from most of the prestigious universities in the United States, Australia, and Portugal. He is now visiting professor to various outstanding universities and colleges throughout the world. Among many recognitions, awards, and honors, he shared a Nobel Peace Prize or the co-laureate with Bishop Carlos Bello in 1996. He wrote many articles and famous books in which later translated into different languages such as Norwegian, French, and German. He speaks at least 5 languages fluently. It would be nice if you could speak Thai. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency, the Honorable Dr. Jose Ramos-Horta.
First, I would have to apologize that I do not have a written speech. I will just talk ad lib, but based on the theme was based on a chapter of a book that was published recently in Singapore, the World Scientific Publishing Company. I do not have access to a copy of the book, so I will talk off the top of my head from what I had written a few months ago. But first, I would like to say how honored, pleased I'm here to be in this very prestigious institution. And I'm a bit intimidated knowing who are the students or the participants, actually highly respected, trained professionals. I would feel more comfortable talking to undergraduate students. But since I made a mistake in accepting the invitation to come to this prestigious forum, I have to endure any embarrassment or humiliation. I thank the International Peace Foundation for this great, for this tremendous initiative that with so much courage and creativity they have organized. All of us, many Nobel Peace Prize laureates and other fields, are honorary members of the foundation, are actively supporting it because of the extraordinary work the small team led by Professor Morawetz have put together in such a short period of time. And I'm particularly happy to be here in Thailand and in this institution, particularly because of tremendous contribution that Thailand as a country and government, and particularly the Thai armed forces, have contributed to restoration of peace, security, and nation building in my country. You might remember that Thailand was one of the first countries to agree to respond promptly, positively to the appeal by the Secretary General and the Security Council for peacekeeping forces to be sent to Timor-Leste in September '99. It was not an easy decision then for Thailand. It was first time ever that ASEAN countries, or actually Asian countries, would dispatch combat troops to a conflict situation in a Southeast Asian region under Chapter 7 of the United Nations, and that means shoot to kill if necessary. So it was a very strong, robust mandate, politically difficult, but because of the environment, but also risky security-wise, because those who made a decision in Thailand or in New York could not predict what would happen on the ground. If something went wrong, then those who in Thailand or elsewhere oppose Thailand involvement then would say, well, we told you so. So it required courage and political leadership in this country, and that's why we are very grateful. Thailand sent one of its best generals at the time with Interfet, Songkiti. Most of you, or some of you probably know. And later, it sent yet another great general and diplomat, Bun San, who is here. He was not only a great military person, but he was also a diplomat. And remember that commanding a peacekeeping force of that magnitude, with so many nationalities, without previous training among them, joint training and exercise, with different cultures, different schools, require a lot of not only professional military operational experience, but require a lot of diplomatic human relations skills to manage the sensitivities, the different cultural background, but also to manage the different personality and the egos. Some very big egos, some small, some modest, some unpredictable. And Bun San did a tremendous job, so much so that I remember when he left, and we were told that someone else would come, and when we first met Vinay, we thought, God, is Vinay going to be up to the standards set by Bun San? And but again, Vinay also lived up to the expectations, to the standards left behind by his immediate predecessor. The Thai army was not only professional, but it was in terms of military duties, but also was very human and created a lot of personal relationships and friendship, and left lasting impression on the people where they serve. In Dili, initially, in Baukau district, and then in the Suai district. So we are very, very grateful to the Thai armed forces for that. And also, the Thai government has been very generous in providing technical support for the rebuilding of the country, training of our people, inviting numerous East Timorese local leaders to visit the Thai parliament, but also community development initiatives. And we are very grateful that Thai government also was among the very first to establish a full-fledged embassy in our country. And we hope that in the years to come, the relationship between our small country and this great country of yours will further consolidate. I have offered this title for the series, The Unipolar World, Can the US Lead? For obvious reasons. The timing of it, the tremendous debate, controversy, hard feelings, resentment across the Atlantic and the world towards the center of this unipolar world, which is Washington. And what do I know about it? Well, I know about it not as an academic, although I took some time in the United States in the 80s as a student of the then National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, Brzezinski, studying U.S. security policies at Columbia University, but more so because of my own life experience in the U.S. By accident of history, in '75, I ended up in the U.S. and lived there continuously for the following 15 years. And then in the following other 10 years, I traveled back to the U.S. 3, 4, 5 times a year, and either to work at the UN or Washington or to give lectures around the country. So accumulated some modest knowledge, understanding of that complex country, its institutions, people, political processes, and so on. I accompanied every presidential election since '76, since Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter fought the very first battle, or Jimmy Carter ended my very, very good friend Ted Kennedy, who at the time I was hoping he would win, but lost disastrously. And ever since, followed Ronald Reagan election, which created so much at the time dismay and discouragement, and then the less tumultuous years of George Bush, that was only disturbed by the Gulf War, followed by the very exciting 8 years of Bill Clinton, and now the more challenging, risky, dangerous years under the current administration. And I have been invited to, in June, to attend the Democratic Convention in Boston, and I might go there to attend. And that experience with the US was also in parallel with my experience as the East Timorese resist representative at the United Nations. So both went hand in hand, understanding the partnership, sometimes friendly, sometimes real partnership, sometimes very unfriendly, hostile between Washington and the United Nations. And that's what brought me to try to first write in that chapter of a book, and now trying to write a book, which I hope I will conclude this year, called The Americans and the Rest of Us, which again is not an academic book, but rather a reflection on my experience in that country, trying to offer a more balanced, maybe nuanced view of the United States. All my life, I never accepted dogmas. I never embarked on making sweeping judgments about one particular country or another or a group of people. I never believed that truth is always on one side only. I never believe in black and white judgments. And therefore, I don't make either sweeping judgments about the United States, its policies, its motivations, and so on. There have been numerous books, hundreds and hundreds of them, written about U.S. foreign policy. Sometimes books are produced within few days of an event taking place. After September 11, within days there were books about September 11. So it's very difficult, particularly for someone like me who takes 2 years to write a very simple book, which sometimes no one buys it. I wrote a book published in New York in 1986, 87. It had great reviews in the New York Times, and yet no one bought it. A few years later, a young lady in Washington, you probably heard a lot about her a few years ago, not long ago, very young, wrote a book. In 2 weeks, it became a bestseller. I was very offended because I thought my book was such a great book, no one bought it. And then that young lady, I don't remember her name, something like Monica, whatever, she wrote a book and it became a bestseller. And I thought, God, what does she know that I don't know, that her book is so more interesting than mine? So I almost give up trying to write serious books in the United States. So when my publisher in New York insists to deliver the manuscript, I'm very skeptical. But anyway, I made a commitment and I will do so. The topic, the unipolar world and can the U.S. lead, has two sides to it. One, I believe there is no much controversy about it. Since the end of the Cold War, the implosion of the Soviet Union, the liberation of the Baltic states, Central and Eastern Europe, the dismembering of the then Soviet Union into many newly independent states, the weakening of the Soviet economy, and particularly of its army, defense forces, its inability to project its forces, its power, now not much beyond its borders, the loss of influence in many key areas of the world, the Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, and particularly in relation to Central and Eastern Europe, inevitably leave the world with one major power, one superpower that dominates in almost every sphere, economics and military. Way back hundreds of years, one truth was there always, and that is, if you have a military might, if you have economic power, you rule. If you have economic power alone, but without military might to protect your interests, you do not rule. And that was a very basic, simple truth for centuries. In this 21st century, with the age of internet, global television, the interconnectedness of humanity that makes the world much smaller, whereby one event taking place in one particular village somewhere in the world, very within minutes, hours, reverberate across the world, there emerges a new force in international relations, a new actor, and that is civil society. 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago, to some extent, 20 years ago, we could say, foreign policy making process, but also national policy making process was almost an exclusive monopoly domain of elected or unelected bureaucrats. Even today, in some countries, civil society, public opinion still have a very little say in foreign policy making. Even France, where the president still has utmost powers in security and foreign policy issues, I do not recall ever throughout recent French history where common people, civil society, had much influence on the decisions that the French president wanted to make on foreign policy. The same does not happen in the United States, in UK, and in other countries. But increasingly, more and more civil society influence shaping of foreign policy. Sometimes they don't succeed. But you could see the hundreds of thousands of millions who demonstrate in the weeks leading up to the Iraq war. You can witness through the demonstrations every time the World Bank, the IMF meet in their annual gatherings in Washington, Seattle, Prague, and so on. And more and more they will become effective, better organized, more focused, credible, and they will shape the agenda. The case of East Timor in '99 is also an illustration of the power of civil society. Small country of less than 1 million, yet it inspired, mobilized millions around the world who went to the streets, to the internet, and compelled governments, institutions like the UN, the World Bank, to intervene. This was unthinkable 20 years ago. So, beyond the powers of economics and military might, there is this enormous power of today, and that is civil society, that the governments have to take into account more and more in the years to come. It's healthy, democratic, but also has its own negative aspects to it. Civil society can be led wisely, but civil society can also be manipulated, instrumentalized to serve particular agendas. As I watched the demonstrations leading up to the Iraq war, I watching on CNN and BBC, I could recognize many faces, former Stalinists of the 60s and 70s, that having lost their crusade to overthrow the capitalist system, having seen the dream of the proletariat empire, the proletariat paradise imploded, they try to hijack other popular causes. In Seattle, in Washington, in Davos, in the demonstration leading up to the Iraq war, I recognize faces of the 60s and 70s, and some wouldn't even hide. They came back with the hammer and sickle flag. As even just a few days ago, I was watching a demonstration somewhere in Mexico. The Marxist-Leninists, who should be embarrassed with the failure of their doctrines, with the implosion of the Soviet Union, with all the truth that has emerged about Soviet Stalinist practices in the former Central and Eastern Europe, and yet audaciously they come back. Not only them, but also can be the extreme right-wing elements or the extremist Islamic groups that use the internet with sophistication to unleash this new phenomenon of war, the global terrorism, and manipulate public opinion. So as much as civil society can be an enormous positive force in the shaping of national or international policies, it can be also hijacked, manipulated by increasingly sophisticated organized groups. There is no debate as the strength of this enormous power, and that is centered on Washington. In the debates about this unipolar world, I often read, hear about resentment, sometimes hatred, suspicion of this unipolar power, United States, as if the very fact that the United States today is the only superpower in the world, unchallenged, is something that we should blame the Americans for, that the Americans should apologize for it. Well, why not the European Union? Why not Europe is a balancing power to balance the power of the United States? After the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, many people had illusion that the European Union could be that balancing power. But that is an illusion, wishful thinking, partly because the European Union will take many, many years to consolidate the illusion, the idea, the project of a single real political union. The debate, the controversy on Iraq illustrate still the many profound differences and loyalties, conflicting interests in the European Union. Those beyond Western Europe, Central Eastern Europe, who suffer under Soviet occupation, they still view the US as their real ally. It was the US power throughout the 50s and 60s that saved Western Europe from a possible Soviet aggression. Because let's make no mistake, the Soviet doctrine at the time was expansion. Remember the Brezhnev doctrine. Whenever they could infiltrate, they could gain a foothold, they would. Whenever they were doubtful that the US would counter, they tried. When they were certain that the US would retaliate, they would never dare. They tried in Horn of Africa, they tried in Angola, and a bit more carefully in Central America. So it was the power of the US that kept the peace in Europe. If it were not for that, I don't know what languages the Europeans would speak today. Maybe most of them would be fluent in Russian. And again, it was the United States. It had been the United States that had kept the balance of power in this part of the world, our part of the world. If the US were to leave today, the Korean Peninsula, what would happen to the stock market, currency, economy of South Korea and the immediate region? You would see arms race in the entire region. You would see Japan panicking. It would have to double its defense budget. Taiwan would do the same. And if Taiwan does, China would do. India would do. And if India does, Pakistan would do. So whether we like it or not, and until such a time when someone, a political Einstein, would reinvent the UN and make the UN a real force that is neutral, that is provided necessary tranquility, balance, well, the US is this irreplaceable power. Sometimes they do it by design, sometimes by default. Look at the Balkan region, the wars in Bosnia and later in Kosovo, right in the backyard of the European powers. It was necessary the US to intervene, to lead in Bosnia and later in Kosovo. Time and again, the Americans are criticized for not doing much, doing too little on Middle East. But isn't the Middle East a geographic, cultural, historical extension, quote unquote, of Europe? The Europeans, why shouldn't we ask the same question to the Europeans? You are doing too little, you are doing nothing to resolve the issue of Middle East. And that is the nature of the US preeminence, because of its technology, because of its economy, because of its human resources. We travel around the US, and who do you meet? In some of the best universities, some of the top scientists, Indians, Chinese, Koreans, Afro-Americans, some first-generation migrants, like Colin Powell, one of the greatest statesmen the United States ever had, first-generation, son of Jamaican migrants, one of the greatest medical doctors in the United States, who did a miracle operation many years ago and whom I met by chance without knowing who he was. A young Afro-American doctor in his 30s at the time, when he operated on two German Siamese children who were linked by their brain, by their head, presiding over 70 surgeons to operate on that young two babies linked by their head, and successfully in Washington, D.C. Well, this is the secret of the success of that country. The question is, with that awesome power that it has, its ingenuity, its creativity, its military power, economic might, does it possess the other quality that is necessary for people to respect, to believe, to follow? Does it have the leadership qualities? Or does it believe that having economic and military power alone is enough to impose your will, to impose yourself and others, whether you like it or not, whether you agree or not? You go along with it because you are intimidated. You have no choice. Well, the United States sometimes does exactly this. It does not engage in dialogue. It does not engage in persuasion. It decides and expects everybody else to follow. Well, this is not leadership. This is failure of leadership. And this is what creates a lot of resentment. Many go along with it because they don't have much choice. But the United States should not be surprised with the opinion poll findings around the world that show overwhelming majority in the world of resentment towards the U.S. That explains some of the problems. The U.S. can still be a power that leads. It can learn from its past mistakes, failures, and successes. It can mend fences with the United Nations. It can walk halfway and mend fences with the European Union, with European countries, with Russia, with South America, so that our resources combined can address some of the fundamental problems that we are facing today. Terrorism, understanding the root causes of terrorism, why someone decides to blow herself up, taking along with her innocent civilians, why someone would hijack planes and blow themselves up into the World Trade Center. But it would be far too simplistic to suggest, to accept the argument that poverty is the root cause of terrorism. I personally do not buy that argument. It's nonsense. The poor of this world, their first concern is not to try to buy a ticket that costs a few $1,000s and then blow themselves up. There are millions of poor, hundreds of millions of poor in sub-Saharan Africa. Have you heard of one single African family, woman or man, who bought a ticket, hijack a plane, or commandeer a plane and blow themselves up? I never heard of. I have been to about half of African continent. That continent has been one of the most exploited, humiliated in human history. Remember slavery, remember colonization, remember partition of Africa, remember the Cold War, when all powers, the Americans, the Soviets, the French, the British, the Cubans, everybody played their politics on African soil, dumping in Southern Africa, in the Horn of Africa, hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons, destroying that continent. And yet, you don't find one single homegrown, home-based terrorist group in Africa. If terrorism is produced by poverty or humiliation, well, I should say that almost every African country would have good reasons to have their own jihad against the West. Look at South Africa. Up to recently, blacks were below the status of human beings. They endure apartheid for generations. And look at the leadership of Nelson Mandela and his people. So the notion that poverty or even humiliation justify or create the extremists is nonsense. I had the curiosity to read and to pick up some textbooks from some Islamic schools, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Gaza. I read through some of the rough translations of those textbooks. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The brainwashing, the lies, the distortion, the half-truth, the instigation of hatred towards anything Western or Christian. And this is why you would find so many young people in the Middle East or in Indonesia or in Malaysia having this absurd notion about Christianity and the West. Sometimes not so different from the same textbooks you find in some extreme right evangelist schools in Midwest United States. They talk almost exactly the same language about Muslims. The two extremes are the ones that fan prejudices and hatred and create the armies of terrorists around the world. How to combat it? Can the United States rethink and lead the international community in the common fight against extremism, but also against poverty, against HIV, against malaria? Malaria is a very simple disease that has been there for generations, and yet no vaccine, no cure has been found. Is it because malaria exists only in the tropics and not in Western Europe, in the cold climates of Europe? Well, I tell you frankly, sometimes I wonder. If malaria were to be a disease, an illness that affect the Nordic countries, Western Europe, such a very simple mosquito-borne disease would have been defeated. HIV. President George W. Bush promised more than a year ago $15 billion for HIV in Africa. An extraordinary amount of money. I personally engage in so many arguments with some friends in the US Congress, wonderful individuals who could not see anything good about President George W. Bush. And I would point to them, but don't you acknowledge this extraordinary announcement by the president? Well, they were very cynical and say, Jose, wait and see. Well, more than a year later, actually the administration had only requested something less than $2 billion. And probably only about something like $100 million or so had been disbursed. Promises, empty promises, broken promises for HIV. The United Nations, for the past 20 years, 20 years ago, asked the world community of rich nations to allocate 0.7% of their national incomes for overseas development assistance. 0.7%. You know how many countries have met this target or gone a bit beyond? 4 or 5 countries. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands. United States, the richest country in the world that benefit more from the rest of the world than any other country, 0.4% or so. Germany about the same, France about the same. But at the same time, the United States is prepared to spend $100 billion on the war in Iraq in a year. Combined, the rich countries provide $50 billion in overseas development assistance. And at the same time, every year, they waste $300 billion in subsidizing their uneconomic agriculture sector. And yet they lecture us about free market, against protectionism when they spend billions of dollars on their ineffective agriculture sector and then dump them on the third world, which means what? We cannot compete with the cheaper cows and the cabbages and fruit from Europe because they're heavily subsidized. And that is, the question is, can the US lead? Or for that matter, can Europe lead? Can the Western world lead? Can they lead when there is so many of these moral failings? I end my comments about the United Nations. Many of us in time of crisis, such as the one in Iraq, we turn to the UN as the solution, the savior of the world. Well, that is great fantasy. And totally ignore the very nature of the institution. What is the UN after all? Sometimes people mistake the Secretary General of the UN for the United Nations. Well, Kofi Annan is a wonderful, great human being. But the UN Charter says something along these lines. The Secretary General is the Chief Administrative Officer of the organization. That's his title, his portfolio. He has 191 bosses, including myself. Now that we are a member of the UN, we are also Kofi Annan's boss. Of course, some are more important than others, you know. I think Kofi Annan pays a bit more attention to Washington, London, Paris, what they say, than to what President Xanana Guzman has to say about how the organization should run. But academically speaking, you know, we are all the bosses of the UN. You are from this region of the world. You observed in the 70s the tragedy unfolding in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. The greatest genocide after World War II was unfolding in this region of the world. What did the Security Council do then? Paralyzed, maybe even indifferent. The reasons, I don't need to elaborate, you know. Or if you don't, you can read, analyze, speculate. As the UN also failed, as recently as '94 in Rwanda. Peacekeeping troops were already on the ground, and yet they were given orders to leave when the genocide unfolded. 700,000 people died. Bosnia, the same. Uganda, like also in the 70s under Idi Amin. Well, these were the failings of regional organizations or of the United Nations. So is the UN going to be the savior of the world, do better than the unipolar world? Yes, it can do better. It is the necessary alternative to the unipolar world. But as long as the United Nations is not reformed, but reformed with political will, political leadership, well, we will be subjected to, time and again, running to the only superpower in the world to help resolving some of our problems. Like in the Middle East, everybody criticized the United States, but they all expect the US to help. Like in Bosnia and Kosovo, everybody expected US leadership. Everybody ran to Washington to try to seek their intervention. If we don't want that, then world leaders must come together, reform the UN, adapt it to the needs of the 21st century, to make it a bit more effective so that we diminish the excessive influence of this one superpower, United States. Thailand has the privilege of having a former Prime Minister, Annan, chairing the commission of wise people to advise the General Assembly, the Secretary General, of some changes. Well, I'm curious and wait to read their advice. But one thing that I, as an individual, would like to see is to see the Security Council expanded. Why only the 5 permanent members that came from World War II? Why would UK and France are permanent members and not India, a country 1.1 billion, nuclear power, industrial power now? Western countries have 3 representatives at the Security Council as permanent members. Latin America has none. Africa has none. Why not Japan or India or Indonesia? Why not Brazil? Why not Egypt, the cradle of civilization? Why not Germany? Should Germany continue to be punished for World War II? But if you bring in Germany, how about Poland? The Polish would ask. So it is not so simple, but at the same time, the veto power would have to be eliminated. Make no sense that one single country can block the entire system. A 2/3 majority voting system should be introduced in the Security Council for all decisions. The US itself should be one of the countries that should lead in the reforms of the United Nations. And last but not least, in the case of East Timor, the United Nations has shown that when there is political leadership, partnerships, coalitions can be built around a belief, a conviction to end a conflict, to build peace. East Timor is a very small nation, as you know, and yet the Secretary General, under his moral authority and leadership, he was able to bring together to East Timor countries like Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, Jordan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, South Korea, Japan, in this endeavor to end conflict and build peace in East Timor. A tremendous mix of nationalities, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, working together in East Timor under one leadership of the Secretary General, his representative. Because there is leadership, there is vision, there is compassion, there is political will. Do we have leaders today in this day and age, 21st century, that provide us with the kind of leadership that Mahatma Gandhi provided us in the 50s? Well, time will tell. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Do we have time for questions? No. Well, as you know, in the 50s, there was an attempt precisely to create a third bloc, a third force that would be neutral between the then Soviet Union and the United States, East and West, and that was the non-aligned movement. Bring it together. Now, today, I don't know the exact number of non-aligned countries, but more than 100. So, theoretically, on paper, the multipolarity is supposed to be there already. The Soviet Union disappeared, but we should have now a bipolar world between Washington and wherever the capital headquarters of the non-aligned movement is. But within the movement itself, as you know, there is so many disparate interests. Within the movement, as you know, there were some savage wars that were fought among ourselves, Iran, Iraq. And yet the movement was totally ineffectual to try to address a problem between two non-aligned countries. And then we saw the Iraq aggression against Kuwait, two Arab countries, Muslim countries, non-aligned members. And the list goes on, you know, throughout the African continent. Again, when we look at the issue of the international trade negotiations, we look at Cancun and post-Cancun. The post-Cancun, I refer to the emerging regional trade blocs or bilateral arrangements. The most significant that draw my attention was the India and Mercosur free trade agreement. And Singapore with the United States, Singapore with Australia. Many countries, you know, United States, with the failure of Cancun, they say, well, we go and have a bilateral free trade agreements with different countries. They pick one at a time, to the detriment of those who don't have the leverage, the resources, enough interest for the United States. Meaning, by the developing countries not being pragmatic enough, flexible, moving one step at a time, we fall into the trap, the old trap of divide and rule. Yes, India has enough resources, enough power to enter into a free trade agreement with Mercosur. Well, but how about South Africa might be able to do the same? But how about the rest of Africa? Individually, what can they do? So the inability, of the two camps, rich countries and poorer countries, to reach a compromise on the market access, agriculture sector subsidies, all of that, the main four issues that were in Cancun, well, lead precisely to the more weakening of the third world bargaining power. I remember many years ago, Alan Garcia, then newly elected president of Peru, he announced and called on all debtor countries, to form a cartel of debtor countries. And he said, we will pay only 10% of our total export earnings to our foreign debt. Well, did anyone join him? No, no one. Fell through, because each country has its own. So it's very difficult to, but I agree with what you say. East Timor is the newest country in the world, one of the poorest, weakest. Yes, we think that multilaterally is best serve our interests. I agree with that, obviously. But the problem is precisely that look at the situation in Iraq and other instances of U.S. unilateral initiatives, interventions. We blame the U.S. for its unilateral intervention in Iraq. But I would put the question a bit differently. The U.S. intervention in Iraq was a reflection of U.S. inclination for unilateralism, or it is a reflection, consequence of the failure of multilateralism. Why? 12 years after the Gulf War, after the many 16, 17, or 18 resolutions on Iraq, weapons of mass destruction question, George W. Bush came into office and he found arguments to enter Iraq. Well, if the Security Council had acted on those resolutions to clean up all doubts about weapons of mass destruction, then maybe George W. Bush would have to find some other argument, excuse. Well, questions should be addressed also to the Security Council, to Russia, to China, to the United States itself, to France and the UK. What have you done all these years? So when the Security Council failed to intervene in Rwanda, well, tragically that no one intervened unilaterally in Rwanda. I tell you frankly, if in our neighboring country in Rwanda had intervened unilaterally to stop the genocide, I, José Ramos-Horta, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, half pacifist, I would say, I applaud it. I would even propose that particular president for a Nobel Peace Prize for saving the Rwandans, for doing the job that the UN failed to do miserably. Kofi Annan in Stockholm 2 days ago, he acknowledged that the failure of the UN in preventing genocide in Rwanda. So unilateral action is inappropriate on the textbooks of international law, yes, but we ask the Cambodians, those who survived, were saved by the Vietnamese, whether when the Vietnamese intervened unilaterally, as you know, in '79, they all ran to the international law textbooks and read it quickly and say, sorry, comrades from Vietnam, you are violating international law. You don't have a mandate from the Security Council, so don't save us. Let us die here. You know, when Julius Nyerere, most of you probably have heard, remember, one of the greatest African head of state. He was the only man in Africa throughout the Idi Amin years, breaking the so-called principles of non-interference in internal affairs. He was the one who time and again denounced Idi Amin. No one else made echo of Julius Nyerere criticism of Idi Amin. Well, finally, Julius Nyerere lost patience and sent his troops into Kampala, overthrow Idi Amin, unilaterally, outside the OAU, outside the Security Council. Well, again, I applauded it. Too bad there was no moral, courageous leader next to Rwanda to intervene unilaterally. So Kofi Annan himself, he said, yes, this is the failure of leadership, of political will. So if we can, you know, the third world countries, putting aside their differences and make the UN much more effective, God, yes, that would be the ideal, but it will require people of vision. I have quite a bit of trust in Mr. Annan's, former Prime Minister Annan's leadership in preparing these recommendations to the UN. Maybe, you know, as now is the turn of Asia, it's not written anywhere that the job of Secretary General should rotate among regions. There's nothing there, but it has become more or less practice. Maybe Thailand could or should offer Mr. Annan as the Asian candidate for Secretary General, since he's presiding over this commission to propose ideas for reforms of the UN system. Well, he might be one of the ideal candidates. I don't know whether he'll be interested in the job, but in 2 or 3 years from now, there will be a new Secretary General. 3 years, I think, when the Kofi Annan mandate ends. If Asia wants a Secretary General of its own, well, it better start to find a consensus on the candidates. Otherwise, in 2 or 3 years from now, we Asians will be so embarrassed, cannot agree on one person for the job. And then the Eastern Europeans will jump in and say, no, sorry, now is the turn of Eastern Europe because we never had a Secretary General. I would prefer to see someone from Asia. and it's better that our leaders begin to think through. And then, yes, because with the power of Asian countries, the Asian voting bloc, its economy, it can really make a difference. If you have an outstanding Secretary General from this region of the world, with his moral authority, he can really push for meaningful reforms of the UN system. I wouldn't deny that, of course, there are some aspects of United States and Western policies that create deep resentment over generations in many parts of the world. I was more than a year ago in Guatemala. I was invited by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Rigoberta Menchú to visit her, and I had a long discussion with intellectuals from Guatemala. I was so surprised. I couldn't find one single person in the room who had anything positive to say about the United States. And you will detect this throughout Latin America. Less in Africa, less in Asia, but in many parts of Asia you find the same. Well, you know, there has to be some valid reasons for that. There are valid reasons for many in the Middle East to be resentful because of their perceived view of the US as too lenient on Israel, not enough pressure on Israel to change policies. So there are some reasons. But again, I would say, this is not enough reason. Palestinians, Arabs in general, have not suffered more than Africans in the hands of Europe, the United States, over generations, over centuries. We don't see Africans, hijacking planes. Why then, all these particular groups? I would go back to this, the indoctrination, brainwashing since childhood by those who have a political agenda. I compare the current phenomenon of terrorism to some extent with European terrorist groups of the 60s. You remember Baader-Meinhof, Direct Action in France, Red Brigade in Italy. Who were these people? Carlos Jackal from Venezuela, but working with the Palestinians, with the Red Brigades and all the others. Who were these people? None of them came from poor background. They are all middle class, upper middle class, highly educated individuals who were profoundly ideologically motivated. They believed in the proletariat, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist doctrine to overthrow the capitalist system. So that was their operating doctrine. And they set out to accomplish what they wanted through terrorist activities. How did the Europeans react? Well, with full force, with intelligence, with effective security measures, and almost all of them were obliterated within the following 10, 20 years. And when you look at Osama bin Laden and all the others, they think almost the same way. For Osama bin Laden and the leaders of Jamal Islamiyah in Indonesia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, their agenda is very simple. Overthrow the secular Arab and Muslim regimes from Middle East to Southeast Asia. Impose their own views of what Islam and government should be, modeling after, to some extent, the Ayatollahs in Iran, or more like the Taliban in Afghanistan. So it is largely a political agenda to impose their views, as the extreme left of Europe wanted to impose their views. For the extreme left of Europe, in the 60s, Soviet Union was also an enemy. China less so, Albania of Enver Hoxha was less so. For them, Soviet Union was already a class traitor. They did not follow the exact Marxist-Leninist doctrine. For Osama bin Laden, the moderate Arab regimes like Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, or the moderate Muslim countries in Asia like Indonesia, Malaysia, they are traitors. They don't follow their extremist views. So it is very much a combination of fanaticism, ideology, and the political manipulation. They cannot interpret a better Islam than so many prominent scholars in the world that don't agree with them. And how do we fight them? Well, again, I say, yes, poverty has a bit to do with it, but only in the sense that the poor, the uneducated, are easily manipulated and mobilized as foot soldiers to carry out certain activities on the ground. But for the very high-tech terrorist activities in Europe, in the United States, you look who did it. They're all engineers, highly trained, educated individuals whose parents were rich, all themselves were rich, who could afford to go to the United States for many months to operate. And who funding them? By the millions. Well, Western intelligence, and in collaboration with countries like Thailand and others, are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Gathering more information, disrupting their information, disrupting their finances, go one after the other, as the Europeans did in the 60s. And that's how I believe it is possible to defeat the fundamentalists, the extremists, through this multi-pronged strategy. Certainly, at the same time, the Western country, the rich country, must spend more on poverty reduction, poverty eradication, on education, eliminate injustices that exist, the glaring injustices that exist. But let's not make the mistake of having the illusion that it is only poverty, like some want us to believe. No, it's very much ideological. And because it's ideological, it's easier to identify, to single out, and defeat them. Well, because this is off the record, I presume, I can talk more openly, but I would say the following. if you look at arithmetics of the US electorate, if the Democrats elect a charismatic leader, like Bill Clinton was, as their nominee, someone who has close contacts, popularity with Afro-American electorate, with the Hispanic electorate, with the Jewish electorate, numerically speaking, he can win. But that means that he has to secure more than 90% of the black votes. It means he has to be charismatic enough to inspire people to go to the polls, to register and to go to the polls. Bill Clinton won more than 90% of all the registered black votes. So Chicano vote, you know, the Latin American, the Hispanic vote, Jews, and minorities. This is the key to a Democrat success. And because obviously it is, you know, off the record and so on, well, many of us would like to see someone like John Kerry. And that's why, you know, when we talk about the United States, well, the United States is not one particular administration. And maybe the Iraqi debate, controversy, and all other policies that have infuriated so many people will cause a lot of rethinking on the new president, and will really offer a much better, greater vision and the leadership for the UN and for the rest of the world. I'm reasonably optimistic. But let me say, you know, having lived enough in the United States, a long time, and having made some bets already in the past on who is going to win, and I lost, I tell you, it's very unpredictable. You know, the opinion polls today, you know, are very academic. We'll see how the war goes in Iraq in the next few months, the economy. But even so, doesn't mean necessarily that if the war goes better, if the economy improves, doesn't mean necessarily that the incumbent can win. There are other factors that can play and make a decision. The problem with U.S. also is the U.S. Congress. Frankly, I tell you, I know many, many members of U.S. Congress, great individuals, great friends, but I understand that a good majority of members of U.S. Congress don't even have a passport. Most of them never travel out of their state or out of the United States. They don't really care, have no notion about the rest of the world. Maybe one great lesson from Iraq and the weeks leading to Iraq is that woke up the Americans, this powerful congressman, that yes, the U.S. is all-powerful, but it cannot be alone. It needs others. It needs friends. This must be one of the great positive lessons of the current situation, so that the United States wake up and realize that great nations or great leaders are those who are capable of showing humility. Humility is a characteristic of great people. The greater you are, the more humble you can be. And the United States, unfortunately, I'm a friend of the United States. You know, President Shanana Guzman often joked with me about I'm being the American ambassador in Timor. So I'm comfortable that no one can accuse me of being anti-US. But frankly, those friends of mine in Washington sometimes, they do things, they say things that are perplexing, to say the least.